Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. Today we are reading issue 177, and just a little catch up on what's been going on. In the last story arc, we started the Mike Carey run, and we started with a little two-part story that was about John coming back to England, and he immediately finds something to do because he goes to visit his sister to tell her that he's not dead like everybody thought because he was in America for a while. And it just so happened that there had been some evil going on in her apartment building that she lives in. So he's been trying to figure that out, and eventually he did. It was all the woman on the top flat. She'd been having her sons kill some prostitutes and take flesh off of them so she could do some magic where she could get high off of their lives. But of course, she only wanted to feel the happy parts, so she would dump out the sadness that was left in those people, and that all was what was corrupting the building. All the sadness went down the pipes and kind of drove everybody crazy that was susceptible to it. So after confronting the old woman and her sons, of course there was a big fight and all that stuff, but basically John ended up winning with the help of a new character named Angie, who was almost one of the victims of these brothers, and John actually had to give his demon blood to her to heal her. And the last dying words of the old woman who was in the flat were the words trade, domine, and scrape. And we left off with John taking a train ride somewhere. I thought it was France because he was talking about France, but actually this issue takes place in England, so I guess he was just riding on the train throughout England. And he had a couple things to follow up on. He had the words or the names that the old woman said when she died, and he also has some postcards from his niece Gemma, who apparently is not where she says she's been. So John is also looking into where she is. So that's where we left off on the last issue, with John on a new mission to figure out where his niece Gemma is and how she kind of ties into this last story arc. So first things first, with issue 177, we got the cover. This one's kind of a collage cover like the last one was. We see some sort of club that looks pretty old. There's a bit of a letter that has John's name on it, like someone sent him something. And then we have a skull, so of course there's going to be death or something in this. And then we have a bunch of portraits of people. We see John at the top, maybe Gemma underneath him, an older man, an older woman, a middle-aged guy, and another middle-aged guy. So we don't know who all of them are, but for sure John is there and maybe Gemma. And we also see on the cover that this is written by Mike Carey with art by the returning Marcelo Fruscian. And as we turn to the first page, we see a building that has a sign on the outside that says Nicholas Gillis Antiques and Collectibles. Then we cut to the inside and we see a man who I guess we could assume is probably Nicholas, and he is straightening a table like he's getting ready for dinner. And over these panels, the narration says, "Must have been 4 months ago easy. Piece it together by what came afterwards. Special guest. Scrape would have gotten everything up really nice. Ambience wasn't something he gave a tinker's fart for usually, but he knew what worked. Maybe he would agonize about the napkin rings. Would Mikhail despise a man who had shit like that on his table?" And over these last couple bits of narration, we see the man inside this building looking at a napkin ring and deciding whether he wants to have it or not on the table. Then we get a panel of him going down the stairs and to the front door, and the narration says, "Doorbell would have rung dead on 10:30, when he said he'd come. Russians know sod all about being fashionably late." So the man inside the house opens the door, and he says in Russian to the man who's there, "Misha, my God, you look fantastic. What are you wearing?" And Misha answers, "It's Italian. Before London, we stopped at Hamburg. An Italian suit made from Germany." And then they kiss, then they break away, and the man who answered the door asks, "Did you bring it?" And Misha answers, "Nicholas, you spoil a kiss like that with your bloody business as usual? Talk about the weather now, and make the stereotype perfect." And Nicholas says, "I'm sorry. This is a big deal for me." And Misha smiles and says, "For me too. Of course I brought it." But as he says this, we see some blood dripping from his lip, and Nicholas asks, "Misha, did you cut yourself?" And Misha asks, "Did I what?" But then he feels something dripping down his face, so he brings his hand up to it and he sees it's blood, and he says, "Shit, maybe I bit my lip or something." But we also see that it's coming from more than just that one spot now. It's also coming from his nose and his ear, and then all of a sudden, he starts bleeding from his eyes, and more blood starts coming out of the other orifices, and he screams, "Fuck your mother!" as he falls down and grabs onto Nicholas's shirt, and Nicholas is screaming, "Misha! Oh Christ! Oh Christ, Misha!" And as Misha falls to the ground, I assume dying, we hear someone say behind them, "Scrape." And then another man says, "We changed our minds. We want a bigger share. Something in the region of 100%. Then we turn the page and we cut to 6 months later, and we see John and Chaz standing in front of the same building, but now it is decrepit, all the windows are shattered, and it looks like someone took a hammer to all the stone outside because it's broken as well, and the wood sign outside is also broken, and it's hanging by a single chain now, and as John looks at this, he says, "Great. Absolute bloody marvelous." And like I said, Chaz is there, so we can assume that Chaz just drove John here, and he was expecting to meet with Nicholas. And we also see on this page that the name of this issue is Red Sepulchre Part 1. So John takes a step inside, and as he smokes, he kind of looks around at the ruins of this place. There's a bunch of smashed stuff on the ground, and it looks like it's been ransacked. And Chaz, who's standing behind John, knows John said something, but he did not hear him say the bloody marvelous comment because he's got headphones in. So he pulls one out and he says, "Hey, sorry, John, didn't catch that." But John says nonchalantly, "Didn't throw it at you, Chaz. Bit of a choker is all. I come 200 miles to see the bugger, and he's dead and buried." And Chaz can see inside, and he notices the things that are smashed on the ground look like antiques. So he asks John, "Some sort of junk dealer, was he?" And John answers, "Fence more like. Broker. Procurer. Horse brasses in the window. Dead man's hands and bat-shit grimoires around the back." And then Chaz says, "It's ironic though, isn't it? I mean, you're dead, or meant to be, and this bloke you wanted to see turns out to be dead too. You'd probably have loads to talk about." And John sarcastically says, "Ha, bloody ha." And as John takes the last drag of his cigarette, Chaz asks, "Now what? Back to the poxy bed and breakfast?" And John answers, "Soho. I've walked into the middle of something. I need someone to tell me what I've missed." And then he throws the butt of his cigarettes on the ground, and he continues saying, "Lend us your mobile, Chaz. I've already blown my cover, so I may as well drop my pants and bugger it properly." Then we turn the page, and we cut to a fancy house. This place has a gate around it. There's 2 big lion statues on either side of the front door, and from the outside we hear someone say, "Joshua, how very novel. Does your presence at my breakfast table imply that you have good tidings for me?" Then we cut to the inside, and we see a large, bald, white man sitting at a breakfast table eating breakfast, and he's got a knife in his hand. And we see a younger white man standing in front of him in a suit, and he's got white, short hair, and we can assume this is Joshua. And even though they haven't, said this officially, this is Joshua Wright, the kind of low-rent Constantine from Warren Ellis's run that killed John's old girlfriend Isabel. And the last we saw of him, John and Watford had put Joshua Wright face down on a rotting dead body in an old morgue that was not working anymore. And that was all his payback for the murder of Isabel. But he seems to be doing better now. He looks a lot more clean cut. He doesn't have the long white hair. He's got short white hair. And he looks a little bit more classy. So to the question the man asked him of if he had good tidings, Joshua answers, "Depends on your point of view, I suppose. I had the bitch go through another lot of boxes. No joy. Gillis is still screaming, but that's not the same as talking." And the fat man at the table does not seem very impressed, and he says, And yet, I don't imagine you're here to tell me that no news is good news. I suspect that there is a however lurking somewhere close to the tip of your tongue." And then Joshua gives a big smile and says, "Constantine's alive, and he's here." And the fat man at the table doesn't smile. He just says, "Well now, that changes everything." Then we turn the page, and we cut to Chaz driving John around. And Chaz is listening to some sort of How to Learn French tape series. And Chaz is smiling as he's listening, but John doesn't look too happy. He's got a bit of a grimace on his face. So the speakers in Chaz's car say,
"Il y a 5 pommes dans le tonneau et 3 dans la braie. Combien de pommes y a-t-il?"
And Chaz answers in his broken French, Il y a 8 pommes. And total, And he's smiling like he nailed it as he says that. And then John says from the back, Christ, there are circles of hell that are like this, except they're warmer. And then Chaz gets a big grin on his face and he says, Europe's on its way, John, like it or not. Gotta be ready. Where are we going exactly? And John answers, Tate's. Just park along here. It's where the Hocus Pocus crowd hang out and worship each other. I'd ask Map, only he's a surly bugger these days. And if you remember who Map is, he's a supernatural entity that we were introduced to during the Warren Ellis run, much like some of these other characters like Joshua Wright and the police officer Watford. And Map is specifically known for being to locate anyone or anything in London, and John has previously used him to help him find Joshua Wright in the previous arc by Warren Ellis that I mentioned. Which, if you want a refresher, that one's called Haunted, so you can go back to the Warren Ellis run and check those out. So since Chaz knows John is looking for information, he asks, What is it you're looking to find out? And John answers, Well, the starter for 10 has got to be where the fuck is my niece? But I reckon there's a big bastard of an iceberg lurking underneath that one. And then Chaz pulls over to let John out, and we see there's a sign that reads Tate's, which is where John wanted to go. And just as John's about to get out of the car, Chaz turns around to him and asks, So what's that burned out shop got to do with anything? Referring to Nicholas Gillis's shop, the place that was all broken into. And John answers, God knows. Only someone mentioned Scrape's name to me, in some very dodgy circumstances. And my own name too, even though I was making a point of not using it. And right as he says those last couple sentences, we get a flash of Gladys from the first story arc of the Mike Carey run. The old woman, as she was dying, said the name Scrape, and she had also called John Constantine, even though he was using a fake name. Now, they didn't really make a big deal of it yet, but Scrape is the nickname of Nicholas Gillis. And the big bald guy that was talking to Joshua Wright earlier was told by Joshua that they still have Gillis and that they're keeping him for questioning, but he's not answering anything yet. So Scrape is Nicholas or Gillis, and John is looking for him because the old woman mentioned his name. So as John gets out of the cab, so does Chaz, and Chaz asks, So you reckon that old witch kidnapped Gemma or something? And John answers, No. I reckon she was watching Cheryl's place. Maybe waiting for me to come back. I don't know. I can't even start working on the jigsaw till I've got some more pieces. One thing's for bloody sure, though. Whoever's got Gemma wanted me to come after her. Too many clues. Too obvious. It all smells. And then John just walks away from the cab down an alley, and he continues saying to Chaz, So I'm going to start shaking the trees and see what falls out. And Chaz asks after him, Are you going to need backup in there? And John calls back, Nah, Clarice is an old mate, and I called ahead. Then we see John inside of the club, and he is walking up some stairs, and we see an older woman standing by a table at the top of the stairs, and she's got 3 men behind her. One is young and has red hair, and there's 2 older gentlemen. And we've actually seen this woman before in the Warren Ellis run. She once again was helping John find out who had killed Isabel, his ex-girlfriend. And if you remember, she kind of just knows things, and she knows John pretty well. We haven't seen her do any, magic or anything, but apparently she's just part of the magic group that John knows. And if you don't remember what she looks like, she's a very old white woman who's got a lot of wrinkles and is really skinny, but she wears, cocktail dresses, and she has a black choker on, and she has black hair that's, really short in a bob haircut. And she gets all dolled up for this club because she's got black lipstick on and black eyeliner. And as she sees John coming up the stairs, she says, Over here, John. And as John walks over to the table, she says, I think you know Albert. And that is the old man directly behind her, and I believe that's her husband as well. And then she introduces the other old man on her left, saying, This is Packer, who owns this charming establishment. And then about the young red-headed man on her right, she says, And my red-headed friend is McClose. And John looks at all them and says, Charmed. And then Clarice gives a big smile and raises her glass, saying, Well, to your miraculous resurrection. Chin chin. Then John and her move to sit down at the table, and John says, Taking it in your stride, aren't you, Clarice? And then Clarice quotes someone saying, Seen taking in the air at Scrape Gillis's Emporium this morning. Eligible corpse around town, John Constantine. And then she adds, You know how it works, darling. And then John lights up a cigarette and thinks for a second, and then he says, "Yeah, okay. I've got a personal interest in this one. My sister's kid has done a Lord Lucan, and I've heard Scrape's name mentioned by someone who might know where she is. So what's the score?" And then Clarice gets her cigarette out, but it's in a cigarette holder, and as her husband Albert lights it, she says, "The score? An own goal for Scrape, darling. He took his fondness for the rough trade a little too far. Got himself buggered and beaten to death by a Russian trawlerman." And then John asks, "And burned?" And then the redhead man steps forward and answers, "No. The fire was a week later. Kids most likely." And then John gives a big smile and says, "If you say so. There were scuff marks on the top of the soot. People had been in there a few times since. Like I said, this is personal. Is there something I should know?" And Clarice gives a grin of her own and says, "I thought you knew everything, dear. That's always been your charm." And it seems like Clarice isn't really going to give him anything, so John stands up and he says, "Okay, Clarice, I get the picture. I'm at the Clerkenwell guest house, in case you suddenly remember how much you owe me." And as one of the men pours Clarice some more to drink, she calls to John, who's walking away now, saying, "Watch yourself, John. Don't go dying on us again. It never has as much impact the second time around." Then we turn the page and we cut to John and Chaz walking on a subway platform. And as they're walking, Chaz is kind of confused and he asks, "John, what are you doing? I'm on a meter." And John answers, "I'll just be 5 minutes. Leave off a sec, will you, Chaz? I'm trying to think. Something stinks here. Clarice wasn't just blanking me. She was shit scared, even though she had shambling Albert and his mates around for insurance. Trade, domine, scrape, Gladys said. Trade being what she was offering." And Chaz chimes in, "Domine's in the Lord's Prayer." And John continues, "A bit of hot gossip in exchange for her life. So she must have been pretty bloody sure it was something I'd want to know. Maybe I really am paranoid, and Gladys was just a lunatic who made a lucky guess. But Gemma's still missing, and I still need some answers." And they both stop for a second as they get to the end of the platform and look down the darkness of the subway tunnel, and Chaz asks, "John, where the fuck are we going?" And John answers, "To see Map." And Chaz is confused because I don't think he knows who Map is, and he says, "But I can drive you to..." But John cuts him off saying, "No, Chaz, this is where he lives." And then from the platform, he turns towards the rail, and he throws something in. It looks kind of like a piece of paper crumpled up, and John says a spell saying, "Operite oculi. Into the well I cast this offering, closest to my heart." And then John turns and looks at the TVs on the platform station. I think they're the ones that probably show the schedule of the train. And as John and Chaz both stare at it, John says, "I've got a problem, Map. It's to do with Scrape Gillis, among other things. Assuming you're still Mad Bastard in residence, can I come through and talk it over?" And in response to that, the TV screens explode, and John and Chaz are both covered in shattered glass. John even has bits of glass embedded in his forehead and face, and he's bleeding from those wounds. And John looks at the TV angrily and says, "I'll take that as a no then." Then we turn the page and we cut to a big conference table where there's a bunch of people in suits sitting around, and at the head of that table is the bald man who was standing to the left of Clarice when John was talking to her. His name is Packer, and he is the owner of that club that Clarice hangs out in. And Packard is pointing across the table at Clarice, and he's saying, "I don't believe in coincidence, and I don't like it." And Clarice says back to him, "For what it's worth, I can't see John Constantine chasing the Sepulchre, not to use it anyway." And all of the people sitting at the table look like they're heavy hitters, maybe like the representatives of magic orders or some kind of cabal or something. And to Clarice saying that she doesn't think John would use the Sepulchre, the man to her right says, "Who knows what his bloody agenda is? That fiasco with the Coopers was all Constantine's doing, and the fallout from that hurt all of us." And what he's referencing is actually the little Garth Ennis story arc. I believe it's issues 129 to 133, where John had to make good on a job he did for a mob group called the Coopers, and that was a pretty interesting story. You should definitely go check that out if you haven't heard it already. So to the man bringing up the Coopers, Packer says, "You're missing the point. With Constantine in the picture, Fredericks doesn't need any of us. We're going to get squeezed out. And then he looks at Clarice and says, you know him best. Who do you think he's with? And as he's saying this, we do get like a zoom in on the man to his left, who we also saw earlier with Clarice. He was the redheaded man standing to her right, and his name was McClose. And as Packer is asking Clarice who she thinks John is with, McClose is side-eyeing Packer. So I'm not exactly sure why they're focusing on him, but I figured if they're showing it in the art, it's probably important, so I might as well mention it. So to Packer's question about who John's with, Clarice looks at him kind of annoyed and says, I've never asked, darling, and he's never said. Then we turn the page, and we cut back to the outside of the antique shop that was owned by Nicholas Gillis, or Scrape, as some people call him. And as John stares up at the sign, we get some narration that says, no answers. No trail to follow. By this time, he must have been well pissed off. Otherwise, he probably wouldn't have done what he did next. So as John is staring up at the sign, Chaz, who's just behind him in his cab, says, I can wait for you if you want. There's fuck all left of the day now anyway. And John answers, no, you go home, mate. Otherwise, I'll have Renee after me too. Don't reckon I can cope with that right now. So as Chaz drives off, he waves goodbye and he says, Aye, all right then. Call me if you need anything. So long as it's not the sort of thing that John Carpenter would make a film about. And as Chaz drives off, John says to himself, yeah, merci beaucoup, mate. And then he steps into the darkness of the antique shop and he adds, and après-moi les fucking deluge. I'm not sure if I said that 100% correct. I did use Google Translate to try to figure out how to say that right. And obviously he's trying to speak French to make fun of Chaz a little bit. But I looked up what that meant, and it means after me, the flood. So there's a bit of foreshadowing there. Then John walks a little bit further into the darkened foyer, and he looks down on the ground, and he finds a bit of ashes and probably dust, and he picks it up in his hand, and he makes a fist around it, and then he says, by Samphael, Penaflor, and Iebion, Sondenath, Valanu, Mainom, all doors save one, hear me and come. And then he throws the ashes into the air, and they don't just fall, they actually hit something floating in front of him, and almost like there was an invisible person standing there, and the dirt is revealing him, John sees a face floating in front of him, and he asks, Scrape? And then the dirt in the shape of the face actually transforms into a line that leads out the door, and as John looks at it, the narration says, 3 months cold, but the ash was drifting off to the west, not up or down. And something was sobbing to itself miles and miles away. But he couldn't get a name or a face or a direction. And as John thinks about that, he pulls out a cigarette and he lights it and says, whatever you were up to, Scrape Old Horse, you were in 100 bloody miles over your head, weren't you? And then John walks back out the door and outside, and he says, still are, I'm guessing. Then we turn the page, and we cut to a dim room that's full of artifacts, and we're assuming all the stuff that was taken from Scrape's antique store. I mean, we're seeing scrolls, Neanderthal skulls, sarcophagi, Spartan helmets, shrunken heads, all this kind of ancient relics and curiosities. And a lot of it is in boxes that we can't see what's inside, but all the boxes are numbered. And one of those boxes is sitting on a desk in front of two guys, and it's labeled 52. And as one of the guys opens it, he says, box number 52. And he's staring at a sheet of paper as he says this like he's reading from a list. And then he repeats, 52. Then the other guy in the box starts looking into the box and he starts saying what's inside. And he says, pewter tankard, shrunken head, load of old porno pictures. And then he looks up at the first guy who was talking and he says, Scrape was a queer, wasn't he? What's he doing with this sort of thing? And the first guy answers, porno, pictures, maybe he was ambidextrous, like Sir Elton John. And they kind of smile at that. But then someone enters the room, and it is Joshua Wright, and he says, put that lot down. The bitch gets to have her laying of hands first, and she's only up to box 50. Anyway, I need you for something else. Something a bit more in your regular line. Then we turn the page, and we see John walking at night. It's probably that same night. And he's walking by the edge of some water. I'm not sure if it's the Thames or not. But as he walks under a bridge, we see another man there leaning against a wall and his cell phone rings. And the guy picks up and says, what? Sorry, I didn't get that. Then we see John walk past that man, and then the guy says, the bloke who just... And then he calls out to John, hey, your name Constantine? And John turns and asks, what? And then the guy holds out his cell phone to John and he says, it's for you. And then the person on the phone says, too late to run. Better duck. And John takes that advice and he ducks and also tries to tackle the man who gave him the phone to the ground to save him. But he's too late with that guy as a column of flame blasts just over John's head and through the head of the guy with the cell phone. But John doesn't realize that that guy got hurt because as he lands on the ground, he warns, stay down. Don't move until I... But then he sees the guy's dead and he says, oh, fuck. And then John turns and sees two men approaching him. One of them has a knife and the other has some other weapon in his hand. And John says, flick knives and koshes? You just brought the one shot of balefire then? You useless pair of fuckers. And with that, John stands up tall, and as the attackers get close, he punches the one with the knife in the face, and that makes the guy drop it and kind of stumble backwards. But the other man was able to get behind John and puts him in a chokehold and starts dragging him back. And the guy that dropped the knife picks it up, and he walks over to John, and then he sticks the blade under John's top front lip on the left side, and he makes a little slice upwards, and as John screams out in pain, all of a sudden the two guys get shot with a barrage of bullets. And as they fly backwards, one of them seems to have a handful of, chicken bones or something that goes flying as he falls to the ground. And as John recovers and looks down at them, the bullet holes are smoking and John looks pretty shocked. But as we turn the page, we see John is just walking away from that scene and trying to get home. And as he gets to his flat door, he pulls out his key. But right as he does, the landlord comes out and says, Mr. Collier. And under his breath, John says, shit. And then John turns towards her and she sees the look of his face, how there's a big cut above his lip, and he's got like marks from where the glass hit him in the face earlier, and also his jacket's covered with blood. And she asks, have you been in some sort of fight? And John sarcastically fires back, no, I swallowed a razor blade for a bet, Miss Perkins, and it all went horribly wrong. And she can sense his attitude and she doesn't like it, and she huffs for a second, then she holds up a letter and says, well, a gentleman said to give this to you, but I can't help noticing it's addressed to someone else. And as John takes the envelope, he sees that it says to John Constantine on it, and Miss Perkins says, this is getting really bloody humiliating. Then we turn the page and we cut to inside John's flat where he's washing his face in the restroom. He's definitely trying to clean off his wounds. And as he splashes water on his face, John is surprised as someone says, John Constantine. And also as those words are said, the lights in his room behind him go out. And John looks up and says, shit. Then he turns and looks back in the darkened room and he says, Map, don't bloody do that to me. Not after the day I've had. Where are you? And as he walks towards the room, Map answers, in here. And then John leans on the doorway and doesn't really enter the room. And he says, well, could have sworn I turned the light on. And then the large face of Map appears in the darkness, and it's gigantic, like it's as tall as John is. And John walks further in the room and says, okay, what's the game? There's a fucking war going on out there. And Map answers, yes, I know. I saw it coming. The blood and the betrayals. The paying off of scores. I went underground. And John says, you were already underground. You live in a fucking tube station. And Map says, you found me there, and there were others looking harder than you. Where I am now is better, because it doesn't exist so much. And then John sarcastically guesses, oh right, South End. But Map's not really a joking guy, so he says, you joke, John Constantine, as you always do. But listen to me now. And I should say that the envelope that John got was like one of those big, puffy rectangle envelopes, like the kind you would send something else in it, not just a letter. So we get a zoom-in panel of that envelope, and Map says, when you have played that tape, you will wish to choose a side. My advice to you is to think long and to choose well. Otherwise, you will have to count me among your enemies. And with that, Map disappears, and John opens up the envelope and takes out the VHS tape, and he puts it in the VCR and hits play. And as he does, he is shocked as he sees his niece Gemma appear on screen. And she looks a lot older than I think we've seen her before. I mean, maybe last time we saw her, she was in her early teens. Now she's definitely in her later teens, maybe early 20s. And in this tape, we see her in a cocktail dress, sitting in a chair, and behind her there are two men, one on either side, and to her right is a man holding a bloody knife, and to her left is a man holding a dead chicken that's just had its head cut off, and blood is pouring out of its neck. But she doesn't look scared or in distress at all as she says, "Hello, Uncle John. I've got some friends who are really, really keen to meet you." And the tape continues, but we don't see further because that, my friends, is the last panel of the issue. So we'll have to wait and see what happens next time in issue 178. But until then, if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comicbooks, all one word, at gmail.com. And we will see you on the next one.